The notification chimed on my phone at 9:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was from Clarissa, my son's fiancée. The message was brief, cold, and devastating. Hi, Diane. After talking with my family, we've decided the wedding should be immediate family only. Hope you understand. Thanks for everything. Hold up. I'm curious where you're listening from. And if this story spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, what I have planned for tomorrow is going to blow you away. I read it 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. Immediate family only. As if the woman who raised the groom for 28 years somehow didn't qualify. What Clarissa didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 4 weeks, she'd be walking down the aisle of a venue I'd owned for the past decade. The $60 million Willowbrook estate that she'd gushed about on Instagram wasn't just her dream wedding location. It was my life's work, my legacy, and the empire I'd built from nothing. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea they were completely dependent on your generosity, stay with me. This story is about what happens when quiet strength meets loud entitlement, and why sometimes the most powerful response is simply letting people discover the truth on their own terms. And if you want to hear more stories about hidden strength turning the tables on arrogance, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It's free, and it helps us reach others who need to know that dignity always wins in the end. Now, let me tell you how a single text message set in motion the most uncomfortable month of someone else's life. My name is Diane Westfield, and I'm 54 years old. I've been a widow for 8 years, since my husband Thomas passed away from cancer. We only had one child together, Benjamin, who everyone calls Benji. He's 28 now, works as a software engineer in downtown Riverside Heights, and until recently, he was the kind of son who called his mother every Sunday without fail. That changed when Clarissa Pemberton entered his life 18 months ago. Clarissa is 25, blonde, and comes from what she calls established money. The kind of family that's been wealthy for so long they've forgotten what it's like to work for anything. Her father, Montgomery Pemberton, owns a chain of high-end jewelry stores across the state. Her mother, Vivian, spends her time organizing charity luncheons where the cost of a single table setting could feed a family for a month. When Benji first brought Clarissa home for dinner, she surveyed my modest townhouse in Riverside with the kind of polite smile people wear when they're trying not to show disappointment. She complimented my quaint kitchen and cozy living room, words that sound nice but feel like daggers when delivered with just the right inflection. "So, Diane," she'd said, settling delicately on my secondhand sofa, "Benji tells me you work in hospitality. That must be interesting." I'd nodded simply. I manage properties. Which was true, technically. I just didn't mention that the properties I managed were some of the most exclusive wedding venues on the East Coast, and that I owned them outright. I'd learned long ago that some people hear what they want to hear, and Clarissa had clearly decided I was some kind of small-time hotel manager barely scraping by. The truth was far more complicated. 15 years ago, Thomas and I had started with a single rundown mansion on the outskirts of town. Willowbrook Estate had been abandoned for years, a beautiful 1890s Victorian slowly crumbling under the weight of neglect and family disputes. We'd bought it for a fraction of its worth, spent every weekend for 2 years restoring it by hand, and turned it into the most sought-after wedding venue in the region. Thomas had the vision, but I had the business sense. While he focused on the restoration, the hand-carved moldings, the crystal chandeliers, and the gardens that now sprawled across 50 acres, I built the empire. I negotiated contracts, managed staff, and most importantly, I invested our profits wisely. By the time Thomas got sick, we owned 4 properties. By the time he passed, that number had grown to 7. Today, Westfield Hospitality Group owns 12 of the most exclusive venues within a 300-mile radius.
The crown jewel is still Willowbrook, a breathtaking estate that books solid 2 years in advance, charges $30,000 just for the venue rental, and has a waiting list longer than some college applications. But to Clarissa, I was just Benji's mother who worked in hospitality and lived in a townhouse that needed new curtains. I'd kept quiet about my business for the same reason I'd kept living modestly after Thomas died. I wanted to see who people really were when they thought I couldn't do anything for them. I wanted to know if they'd be kind to a hotel manager, respectful to a middle-aged widow, and genuine with someone they perceived as having no power or influence. Clarissa had failed that test from day one. She had a way of speaking to me that was technically polite, but unmistakably condescending. She'd offered to help me network with people who might need event planning services. She'd suggest I might want to upgrade my wardrobe for the wedding. She once even handed me a business card for a really good financial advisor, because it's never too late to start planning for retirement. I'd smile and thank her, all while mentally calculating that my net worth was probably 20 times her father's.
But the breaking point hadn't been her condescension toward me. It had been watching my son slowly start to see me through her eyes. Benji had always been proud of his mother, proud of how I'd built a life after losing his father. But lately, he'd been making excuses for me instead of bringing me around his new social circle. He'd stopped mentioning my work entirely, as if managing properties was somehow embarrassing. And now this. A text message uninviting me from my own son's wedding because I didn't fit Clarissa's vision of immediate family. What she didn't realize was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. Not because I was vindictive, but because sometimes the universe has a way of teaching lessons to people who desperately need to learn them. I set my phone down and walked to my home office, where I kept the contracts for all my properties. Willowbrook's booking agreement was in the front of the file, signed by one Clarissa Ann Temperton, with a deposit of $15,000 and a balance due of $45,000, all payable to Westfield Hospitality Group, all owned by the woman she'd just uninvited from the wedding. We poured our hearts into researching and telling this story. If you're hooked, show some love with a subscribe. Now, where were we? The story of how I built Westfield Hospitality Group isn't one I tell often, but it's the foundation of everything that was about to unfold. When Thomas and I first saw Willowbrook Estate in 2012, it was a disaster. The roof leaked, the floors were rotted through in places, and the gardens looked like something from a horror movie. But Thomas saw past all of that. He walked through those empty rooms and said, "Diane, this place wants to celebrate love again." We were both teachers then. He taught high school history, I taught elementary school. We had modest savings, a small inheritance from my grandmother, and absolutely no experience in the hospitality business. What we had was vision and the willingness to work 18-hour days for 2 years straight. I learned everything. How to read contract constructions, how to negotiate with vendors, how to manage cash flow when every month felt like we might lose everything. Thomas focused on the restoration, painstakingly researching every detail to bring the mansion back to its original glory. I focused on turning it into a business. The first wedding we hosted was our friends, practically for free, just to test our systems. The second was a small ceremony for $3,000. By the end of our first year, we were booking weddings at $8,000 each and had a 6-month waiting list. But I wasn't content with just one property. While Thomas perfected Willowbrook, I was already scouting our next acquisition, an abandoned country club in Millbrook, a historic inn in Fairhaven that the owners couldn't afford to maintain. Each property was a puzzle to solve, a business to build, a dream to restore. When Thomas got sick in 2015, I never slowed down. If anything, I accelerated. Medical bills were astronomical, and I needed the business to support us both. I worked from his hospital room, managing contractors by phone, reviewing contracts while he slept through chemo sessions. The day he died, I owned 5 properties and employed 43 people. By 2020, that had grown to 8 properties and nearly 100 employees. Today, Westfield Hospitality Group is worth $60 million, employs 150 people across 12 venues, and books more than 400 weddings per year. I could have moved to a mansion in Riverside Heights' most exclusive neighborhood. I could have bought designer clothes and luxury cars. Instead, I kept living in the same townhouse Thomas and I had shared, driving the same modest sedan, shopping at the same grocery store. The business was never about the money for me. It was about creating moments of perfect happiness for people on the most important day of their lives. Every detail mattered, from the way sunlight streamed through Willowbrook's restored stained glass windows to the carefully tended gardens where couples exchanged vows. But somewhere along the way, I'd learned the value of being underestimated. When people thought I was just a small-time property manager, they showed me their true character. They revealed how they treated people they perceived as having no power, no influence, no ability to help or hurt them. Clarissa had been revealing her character for 18 months. The signs had been there from the beginning, but they'd grown worse as the wedding approached. 3 months ago, Clarissa had insisted on touring potential venues with just Benji, claiming she wanted it to be their special moment together. When I gently suggested I might like to see where my son was getting married, she smiled that perfectly practiced smile and said, "Oh, Diane, I'm sure you'll love whatever we choose. You probably haven't been to many venues like the ones we're considering." She was right about that. I hadn't been to venues like Willowbrook as a guest. I'd been to them as an owner. 2 months ago, when they had announced their engagement party, I'd offered to help with planning. Clarissa had patting my hand like I was a child offering to help with calculus. "That's so sweet of you, but Montgomery has already hired the best event planner in the city, someone who really understands our elite level of expectations." The event planner she was referring to was Jasmine Rodriguez, who happened to work exclusively with Westfield Hospitality Group properties and had coordinated over 200 of my weddings.
Last month, when the topic of wedding flowers came up, I'd mentioned that I knew some excellent florists. Clarissa had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh, honey, we're using Harrison and Associates. They only work with the most exclusive venues. I don't think they'd be familiar with the kinds of places you usually deal with." Harrison and Associates had been providing flowers for Willowbrook for 6 years. But the real breaking point had come 2 weeks ago, during what was supposed to be a family dinner. Clarissa had been showing photos of the venue to her friend Portia over FaceTime, gushing about every detail. "It's absolutely divine," she'd said, panning her phone camera across the dining room where we were sitting. 50 acres of gardens, a ballroom that seats 200, and the most gorgeous bridal suite you've ever seen. Of course, it's frightfully expensive, $30,000 just for the venue, but Montgomery insisted we deserve the best. I'd been washing dishes at the sink, listening to her describe my life's work like she'd discovered some hidden treasure. "The waiting list is insane," she'd continued. "Most people have to book 2 years in advance, but somehow we got a cancellation for exactly when we wanted. It's like fate." It wasn't fate. It was me, quietly moving things around to accommodate my son's wedding date. "And the owner is supposedly some local woman who built the business from nothing," Clarissa had added, her tone suggesting this was somehow quaint rather than impressive. "Very bootstrappy. I'm sure she's lovely, but we probably won't interact with her much. Montgomery's assistant handles all the vendor communications." Benji looked uncomfortable during this conversation, but he hadn't said anything. He'd stopped defending me months ago, stopped correcting Clarissa's assumptions, stopped mentioning my work at all. Watching my son slowly become embarrassed by his own mother was more painful than any insult Clarissa could throw at me directly. The final straw had been last week's wedding planning meeting at the Pemberton house. I'd been invited, presumably as a courtesy, and had arrived to find myself seated at a table with Clarissa, her mother Vivian, and her sister Anastasia. Vivian had been holding court, discussing table settings and floral arrangements with the authority of someone who'd never had to consider a budget.
We simply must have the gold Chiavari chairs. The venue's standard chairs are adequate for most people, but we're not most people. The venue's standard chairs were custom-made Italian pieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And we'll need to upgrade the sound system, something more sophisticated than whatever they usually use for their typical clientele. The sound system at Willowbrook was a $15,000 custom installation I personally oversaw. But it was Clarissa's next comment that had pushed me over the edge. I do hope the owner woman doesn't try to insert herself into our day. I've heard she can be a bit involved. Some of these small business owners get so attached to their little ventures, they forget their place. Their place. As if providing the foundation for their perfect day somehow made me a servant rather than a professional. I smiled and excused myself to the bathroom where I'd stared at my reflection and made a decision. I'd spent 18 months being patient, being understanding, being the bigger person. I'd watched my son's fiancé dismiss me, diminish me, and disrespect everything I'd built. And now she'd uninvited me from the wedding entirely. It was time for Clarissa Pemberton to learn exactly who she'd been talking about all these months. The morning after receiving Clarissa's text, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Nothing. Not nothing in the sense of giving up or backing down, but nothing in the sense of stepping back and letting the situation unfold naturally. Sometimes the most powerful action is simply allowing people to face the consequences of their own choices. I made coffee in my small kitchen, sat at the table Thomas and I bought at a garage sale 12 years ago, and opened my laptop. The Willowbrook booking system showed Clarissa's wedding prominently on the calendar for April 15th. Just 4 weeks away. The contract was ironclad, signed and sealed with every detail of their extravagant celebration mapped out in precise terms. My phone buzzed with a call from Benji. I let it ring 3 times before answering, buying myself a moment to prepare for what I knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. Mom? His voice sounded strained, uncertain. I heard about Clarissa's message. Did you? Look, I know how it must seem, but she's just stressed about the wedding. Her parents have these expectations, and there's a lot of pressure to make everything perfect. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the silence stretch. Benji had always been uncomfortable with silence, even as a child. He'd fill quiet moments with explanations, justifications, anything to avoid sitting with difficult truths. The guest list got really complicated, he continued, words tumbling out faster now. Her family is huge, and my dad's family takes up a lot of space, and the venue has these capacity restrictions. What venue? I asked quietly. It's called Willowbrook Estate. It's this incredible place about an hour outside the city. Clarissa fell in love with it the moment she saw it. The waiting list is insane, but we got lucky with the cancellation for exactly when we wanted. It's like fate.
Lucky. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that word. My son had no idea that his luck was actually his mother quietly rearranging her business to accommodate his happiness. It sounds beautiful, I said. It is. Mom, you'd love it. The gardens are spectacular, and there's this ballroom with these amazing chandeliers, and the bridal suite overlooks this pond with swans. He was describing my life's work to me like it was a fairy tale he'd stumbled into. The chandeliers he was gushing about were ones I'd personally selected and had restored by a specialist in Boston. The pond he mentioned was one Thomas had designed and I'd had installed at considerable expense because he'd dreamed of swans gliding past the windows on wedding days. "I'm sure it's lovely," I said. "I hope you have a wonderful celebration."
"Mom, please don't be like this. Clarissa really didn't mean anything by it. She wants everything to be perfect." I understand perfectly, sweetheart. Sometimes people have very specific ideas about what perfection looks like. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation I'd just had. My son was trying to justify his fiance's behavior, trying to make me understand why I wasn't welcome at his wedding. He had no idea that the venue he was describing with such awe was mine, that the luck he'd credited for securing it was actually his mother's love. The irony was almost poetic. Clarissa had uninvited me from my own property. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing vendor contracts. The florists, caterers, photographers, musicians, all of them were people I'd worked with for years, people who knew me as the owner of Willowbrook Estate. Many of them had started their businesses working my weddings, had built their reputations on events I'd hosted. None of them had any idea they were preparing for my son's wedding. By afternoon, I'd made a decision about how to handle the situation. I called my assistant, Rachel, who'd been with me for 5 years and knew every detail of the business. "Rachel, I need you to handle all communications for the Pemberton Westfield event from now on." "The April 15th event?" "Of course. Is everything all right, Diane?" "Everything's fine. I just want to maintain some professional distance on this particular celebration." It was a half-truth, but it would suffice. Rachel was efficient and professional, and she'd handle all the pre-wedding coordination without question. I wouldn't be involved in any of the planning calls, vendor meetings, or final walkthroughs. I'd let Clarissa have her perfect wedding planning experience without any interference from the owner woman she'd been so dismissive of. But I'd be there on the day itself, not as the mother of the groom. Apparently, that invitation had been rescinded, but as the owner of the venue. It was my property, after all. I had every right to be present during events, especially significant ones. The wedding contract included a standard clause that allowed venue ownership to be present for quality assurance purposes. It was something I rarely exercised, but the option was always there, clearly stated in the legal documents Clarissa had signed without reading thoroughly. She'd get her perfect wedding, and I'd get to watch her reaction when she finally learned who had made it possible. The next 3 weeks passed in a surreal haze of wedding preparations happening around me, rather than with me. Benji would call occasionally with updates. The flowers were confirmed, the menu was finalized, the weather forecast looked promising, speaking to me like I was a distant family friend rather than my mother. Clarissa, meanwhile, had apparently thrown herself into wedding planning with the intensity of a military campaign. Through my professional channels, I heard about her increasingly demanding requests, her changes to the menu, twice, her insistence on upgrading the lighting system, which was already state-of-the-art, and her complaints about various aspects of the venue that she felt needed improvement. Rachel kept me informed with professional updates, never realizing the personal dimension of what she was telling me. "The bride has requested that we remove all the family photos from the main hallway during her event. She feels they don't match her aesthetic vision." The photos she wanted removed were portraits of families who'd celebrated at Willowbrook over the years, including several of Thomas and me at various stages of the restoration process. I'd hung them there as a reminder of all the love and joy the estate had witnessed. She wants to bring in her own furniture for the bridal suite, says our pieces are adequate, but not quite right for her photos. The furniture in the bridal suite included a Victorian vanity I'd found at an estate sale and spent months restoring, and an antique armoire that had been Thomas's favorite piece in the entire property. And she's hired her own security team for the day. Says she wants ensure appropriate people have access to the grounds. Appropriate people. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Clarissa was so concerned about maintaining the exclusivity of her celebration that she was hiring security to keep out undesirable elements. Elements that apparently included the mother of the groom. But it was the final update that truly tested my composure. "One more thing," Rachel said, checking her notes. "The bride has requested that all staff wear white gloves during service. She wants what she calls a more refined presentation than our usual standard." I'd built Willowbrook's reputation on service excellence. Our staff was trained to the highest standards, dressed impeccably, and treated with the respect due to skilled professionals. The idea that Clarissa found them somehow lacking, that she needed to impose additional requirements to make them suitable for her event, was the final insult.
2 days before the wedding, Benji called with news that shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow still did. "Mom, I know this is short notice, but we're having the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. It's gonna be small, just immediate family and the wedding party." That sounds lovely. The thing is, Clarissa's parents are hosting it at their club, and they have this policy about guest lists. "I wanted to invite you, but I'm not immediate family?" The silence that followed was deafening. My son, the child I'd raised alone for 8 years after his father died, the boy I'd worked 18-hour days to support, the young man whose education I'd funded and whose dreams I'd encouraged, couldn't figure out how to tell me I wasn't immediate family. "It's complicated, Mom." "No, sweetheart, it's actually quite simple. You've made your choice, and I respect it." After I hung up, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the contracts and legal documents that represented everything I'd built. The walls were lined with photos from hundreds of weddings, couples cutting cakes, families dancing, children playing in the gardens Thomas had designed. Tomorrow night, while my son celebrated with his immediate family at some exclusive club, I'd be at home. The night after that, I'd be standing in the back of my own ballroom watching him marry a woman who'd spent 18 months treating me like hired help. But Clarissa had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed uninviting me would make me disappear. She'd never considered that some people don't disappear just because you stop looking at them. She'd especially never considered that some people own the ground you're standing on. The next morning, I called Rachel one final time. "I'll be on site for the wedding tomorrow. Personal oversight." "Of course, Diane. Should I let the wedding party know you'll be present?" I thought about that for a moment, imagining Clarissa's reaction to learning the venue owner would be wandering around during her perfect day. "No," I said finally. "Let it be a surprise." April 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect spring morning that made Willowbrook Estate look like something from a fairy tale. I arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the vendors were scheduled to begin setup, and walked through the property I'd spent 13 years perfecting. The gardens were in full bloom, tulips and daffodils creating rivers of color along the pathways Thomas had designed, cherry blossoms forming a delicate canopy over the ceremony area. The mansion itself gleamed in the morning light, every window sparkling, every detail of the restoration work visible in sharp relief. This was my life's work, my legacy, the place where my son was getting married, even though his bride had decided I wasn't worthy of witnessing it. Rachel arrived at 8:30 with her usual efficiency, clipboard in hand and radio clipped to her belt. She'd been coordinating Willowbrook events for 5 years, but I could see the extra attention she was paying to today's details. The Pemberton Westfield wedding was the kind of high-profile celebration that could make or break reputations in our industry. "Diane, I didn't expect to see you here so early. Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect, Rachel. I just wanted to do a final walkthrough before the chaos begins." By 10 a.m., the vendor trucks were rolling through the gates. I positioned myself in my office overlooking the main courtyard, where I could observe the setup without being noticed. From this vantage point, I watched florists transform the ceremony space, caterers stock the kitchen, and musicians test their equipment in the ballroom.
At 11:30, the wedding party arrived for photos. I saw Clarissa step out of a white Bentley, resplendent in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She moved through the property like she owned it, directing photographers and adjusting details with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Benji looked handsome in his tuxedo, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his phone. I wondered if he was hoping for a last-minute message from me, some indication that I'd forgiven him for excluding me from the most important day of his life. At 12, Montgomery and Vivian Pemberton arrived with their entourage. Montgomery was exactly what I had expected. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that comes from never having to worry about money. Vivian looked like she'd stepped out of a society magazine, every detail of her appearance calculated for maximum impact. I watched them tour the property with Clarissa, pointing out features and making comments I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. They were touring my estate like conquering royalty, admiring what they assumed was simply an expensive rental for their daughter's perfect day. At 1 p.m., guests began arriving for the 2:30 ceremony. I recognized many of them from Riverside Heights social circles, the kind of people who attended charity galas and country club events, who measured worth in property values and stock portfolios. They moved through Willowbrook with the casual entitlement of people accustomed to beautiful things, never questioning who might have created the beauty they were enjoying. At 2 p.m., I made my decision. I changed from my casual clothes into the navy blue suit I kept in my office for important meetings, pinned my hair back in a professional style, and walked downstairs to join my own son's wedding. I positioned myself at the back of the ceremony area, behind the last row of chairs, but clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look. Most of the guests were focused on the front, where Benji stood with his groomsmen, but a few turned to glance at the woman in the navy blue suit who'd appeared among them.
Clarissa's processional music began, and I watched my son's face light up as his bride appeared at the top of the aisle. Whatever else I thought about Clarissa, I couldn't deny that she loved Benji, and he clearly adored her. For a moment, watching them together, I felt a pang of genuine sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to this point. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. The officiant spoke about love and commitment. Benji and Clarissa exchanged vows they'd written themselves, and when they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause. It was during the receiving line that Clarissa first noticed me. I saw her eyes scan the crowd as guests approached to offer congratulations, and I watched her expression change from radiant happiness to confusion to something approaching alarm when she spotted me standing calmly near the garden entrance. She whispered something to Vivian, who followed her gaze and frowned. Then Vivian whispered to Montgomery, who turned to look directly at me with the kind of stern expression he probably used on employees who disappointed him. I smiled politely and stayed exactly where I was. During cocktail hour, as guests mingled on the terrace and wandered through the gardens, I moved through the crowd with practiced ease. I knew every inch of this property, every best angle for photos, every spot where the acoustics were perfect for conversation. Several guests complimented me on my knowledge of the venue, assuming I was part of the catering staff or event coordination team. It was Montgomery who finally approached me directly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Are you with the wedding party?" "Not exactly," I replied evenly. "I'm Diane Westfield." I watched him process the name, saw the moment when recognition began to dawn. "Westfield," he repeated slowly, as in the mother of the groom. And as in Westfield Hospitality Group, which owns this property. The color drained from Montgomery's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He stared at me for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You own Willowbrook?" "I built Willowbrook," I said simply, "from the ground up. Every detail you've been admiring today, every element your daughter praised in her planning meetings, every aspect of this property that made it worthy of your family's celebration, I created it." Montgomery called for his wife and daughter with the urgency of someone facing a crisis.
Within minutes, I was surrounded by the Pemberton family, all of them staring at me like I was an apparition that had materialized at their perfect party. "I don't understand," Vivian said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You're the venue owner? But Clarissa said you work in hospitality management." "I do manage hospitality properties, actually. I manage 12 of them. This one is my flagship property." Clarissa had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. "But you live in that little townhouse. You drive an old car. You dress like..." "Like what, Clarissa? Like someone who works for a living? Like someone who doesn't need to advertise her success with designer labels and luxury cars?" The small crowd that had gathered around us was pretending not to listen while hanging on to every word. I could see other wedding guests beginning to notice the tension, heads turning in our direction. "I don't understand why you didn't tell us," Montgomery said, trying to regain his composure. "If you owned this place, why would you let us... Why didn't you say something?" "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I couldn't do anything for you. I wanted to know how you treat someone you perceived as powerless." I looked directly at Clarissa. "And you showed me exactly who you are." "Mrs. Westfield, please," Clarissa said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant any disrespect. I was just trying to plan the perfect wedding." The perfect wedding. The one that was so perfect it couldn't include the groom's mother? The one where you hired security to keep out inappropriate people? The one where you complained about my staff's standards and demanded they wear white gloves to meet your refined expectations? Benji appeared at my shoulder, looking confused and increasingly alarmed. "Mom, what's going on? What are you doing here?" I turned to face my son, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. "I'm attending your wedding, sweetheart. Not as your mother, apparently, since I've been uninvited from that role, but as the owner of this venue, which is my right according to the contract your wife signed." The word wife hit him like a physical blow. He looked from me to Clarissa to her parents, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "You own Willowbrook?" "I built Willowbrook. For 13 years, I've poured everything I had into making this place special. When you told me about your venue, when you described the gardens and the ballroom and the bridal suite, you were describing my life's work. Work that your wife dismissed as the product of some local woman who needed to know her place." Clarissa stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Westfield, please, I'm sorry. I didn't know. If you had known, you would have treated me differently." "But that's exactly the problem, Clarissa. Your kindness, your respect, your basic human decency, they're not supposed to be conditional on what someone can do for you."
Montgomery cleared his throat, trying to salvage the situation. "Mrs. Westfield, surely we can resolve this misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss some form of compensation for any inconvenience." I held up my hand to stop him. "Mr. Pemberton, you've already paid for this venue. The contract is fulfilled. Your daughter has had her perfect wedding in the perfect location with perfect service from my staff. I'm not here for compensation. I'm here because this is my property and I wanted to see my son get married." I looked around at the assembled guests, many of whom were now openly staring at our family drama. "Enjoy the rest of your celebration. The food is excellent, the music is lovely, and the gardens are particularly beautiful at sunset. I should know. I planned it that way." I turned to walk away, but Benji caught my arm. "Mom, wait, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I should have asked more questions, should have supported you better." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw genuine remorse in my son's eyes. Not embarrassment about the scene we were causing, not panic about his wedding day drama, but actual understanding of what he'd allowed to happen. "We'll talk later, sweetheart," I said gently. "Today is your wedding day. Go dance with your wife." As I walked back toward the main house, I could hear the whispered conversations erupting behind me, the shocked murmurs of guests who were finally understanding what they'd just witnessed.
By tomorrow, this story would be all over Riverside Heights social circles. But that wasn't my concern. I'd said what needed to be said, and I'd done it with dignity. Sometimes that's all you can do. Stand in your truth and let other people decide how they want to respond to it. I spent the rest of the evening in my office, watching through the windows as my son's wedding reception unfolded in the ballroom below. The music drifted up through the old mansion's walls, laughter, conversation, the sounds of celebration that I'd heard hundreds of times before, but never quite like this. Around 9 p.m., there was a soft knock on my door. I expected it to be Rachel, checking to make sure everything was running smoothly, but instead I found Benji standing in the hallway, still in his tuxedo, but with his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. "May I come in?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where Thomas used to sit when we'd planned improvements to the property late into the night. Benji settled into it carefully, looking around the office he'd never seen before, at the architectural drawings of Willowbrook's restoration, the photos documenting each phase of construction, the awards from the hospitality industry that lined one wall. "All this time," he said quietly, "I thought you managed hotel properties for someone else. I thought you were struggling to make ends meet after Dad died." I was struggling, just not financially. I was struggling to figure out how to honor your father's memory, how to build something meaningful from our shared dream, how to be both a mother and a businesswoman without losing myself in either role. He picked up a framed photo from my desk, Thomas and me on opening day at Willowbrook, both of us covered in paint and sawdust but grinning like we'd conquered the world. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me think you were barely getting by?" I leaned back in my chair, considering how to answer a question I'd been asking myself for months. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I own. I wanted to know that your respect for me wasn't conditional on my bank account or my business success. But I've always respected you, Mom. You raised me alone after Dad died, worked yourself to exhaustion to keep us afloat. I never needed you to be wealthy to be proud of you. Then why did that change when Clarissa came into your life? The question hung in the air between us. Benji stared down at his hands, his wedding ring catching the light from my desk lamp. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with unshed tears. "Because she made me see you through her eyes. And her eyes—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Her eyes don't see value in anything that isn't expensive or impressive or socially advantageous. And you started seeing me that way too." I started feeling embarrassed by things I'd never been embarrassed by before. Your townhouse, your car, the way you dressed. Clarissa would make these little comments, never mean-spirited exactly, but always suggesting that you could do better, be better, present yourself differently. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same pain I'd experienced watching my son slowly drift away from me over the past 18 months. And you started making excuses for me. I told myself I was protecting you, that if I just downplayed certain things, kept you separated from Clarissa's social circle, everyone would be more comfortable. More comfortable for whom? For Clarissa, for her parents, for me, if I'm being honest. God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I let them turn me into someone I don't recognize, someone Dad would be ashamed of. Through the window, I could see guests beginning to leave the reception, couples walking hand in hand through the gardens Thomas had designed, families gathering for final photos in front of the fountain we'd installed during our 3rd year of operation.
"Your father would be proud of the man you've become," I said. "But he'd want you to remember that character isn't something you wear like a tuxedo. It's something you carry inside you, regardless of what anyone else thinks." Benji was quiet for a long moment, processing not just my words, but the magnitude of what had unfolded downstairs. "What happens now? With Clarissa? With her family? With us? That depends on what you've learned from today. I've learned that my wife spent 18 months insulting my mother to her face without realizing it.
I've learned that I stood by and let it happen because I was more concerned with fitting into her world than protecting the person who gave me everything. I reached across the desk and took his hand. You've also learned that it's never too late to remember who you are and what you stand for. Is it too late for us? For our relationship? Benji, you're my son. That bond isn't conditional on your behavior or your choices or your wife's opinion of me, but respect is something that has to be rebuilt through actions, not words. He nodded, understanding the weight of what I was telling him. I want to rebuild it. I want to be the son you raised me to be. Then start tomorrow. Start with how you treat the people around you, especially the ones who can't do anything for you. Start with remembering that kindness isn't a limited resource that you ration based on someone's social status. Around 11 p.m., there was another knock on my door. This time, it was Clarissa, still in her wedding dress, but with her makeup streaked from tears. She looked younger somehow, stripped of the confident superiority that had defined our every previous interaction. "Mrs. Westfield, may I speak with you?" I gestured for her to sit, noting how carefully she arranged herself in the chair, as if she was afraid of taking up too much space. "I owe you an apology," she began. "Not just for today, but for everything. For 18 months of treating you like you were beneath my notice, for making assumptions about your worth based on appearances, for uninviting you from your own son's wedding. What are you apologizing for, Clarissa? The way you treated me, or the fact that you got caught?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Both, if I'm being honest, but mostly for the way I treated you. My parents raised me to believe that worth is measured by wealth and status and social connections. I thought those were the only things that mattered. And now? Now I'm sitting in the office of a woman who built an empire while I was learning which fork to use at dinner parties. A woman who raised an incredible son while I was worried about whether my clothes came from the right designers." She took a shaky breath. "I'm 25 years old, and I've never accomplished anything that didn't involve spending someone else's money." It was the first genuine thing I'd ever heard her say, the first moment when her guard was completely down. "Clarissa, worth isn't measured by what you accomplish or what you own. It's measured by how you treat people, especially people who can't benefit you in return. I failed that test completely. Then don't fail it again." 6 months later, I received an unexpected visitor at Willowbrook. I was in the gardens, overseeing the installation of a new sculpture near the ceremony space, when I saw a familiar figure walking up the main pathway. Clarissa looked different. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore jeans and a sweater instead of designer clothes, and she carried herself with less artifice than I'd ever seen before. "Mrs. Westfield, I hope it's all right that I came by. Benji said you might have a few minutes to talk." I set down my clipboard and gestured toward a bench Thomas had built beneath an old oak tree. "Of course. How are you, Clarissa?" "Different," she said simply. "I started volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. 3 days a week, I help with intake interviews and job placement assistance." She paused, looking out over the gardens. "It's the first time in my life I've done work that matters to someone other than myself." "How do you find it?" "Humbling. Eye-opening. Some of the women I work with have survived things I can't even imagine, and they treat me with more kindness than I showed you when I thought you were just a hotel manager." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the groundskeeping crew prepare the space for weekend weddings. "She also wanted to tell you that Benji and I have been in counseling, learning how to build a marriage based on our actual values, not the expectations other people have for us." "And what are your actual values?" "We're still figuring that out, but we know we want to be the kind of people who judge others by their character, not their bank accounts. We want to raise children who understand that respect is something you give freely, not something you earn through social status." It was progress, real progress that went beyond apologies and promises. "There's something else," Clarissa said, reaching into her purse. "I wrote you a letter 6 months ago, right after the wedding. I've been carrying it around, trying to work up the courage to give it to you."
She handed me an envelope, worn soft from handling. Inside was a handwritten note on simple stationery.
Mrs. Westfield, I keep thinking about what you said at the wedding, that kindness and respect shouldn't be conditional on what someone can do for you. I realized I've never actually tested that principle. I've never tried being genuinely kind to someone who couldn't benefit me in return. I want to learn how to be better, not just for Benji, but for myself. I want to become the kind of person who sees value in everyone, not just people who can enhance my social standing. Thank you for teaching me that lesson, even though I fought against learning it for so long. Clarissa. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Thank you for this, and for the work you're doing to become the person you want to be. I have so much to learn still. We all do. The difference is whether we're willing to do the learning. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the past year and all the ways it had changed our family. Benji calls me every Sunday again, but now our conversations include discussions about his work at the shelter where he volunteers alongside Clarissa. He asks for my advice on business decisions and life choices, but he also shares his own insights and perspectives. The relationship we're building now is different from the one we had before. It's more honest, more equal, built on mutual respect rather than childhood dependency. Clarissa and I will probably never be close friends, but we found a way to coexist with genuine respect. She's working to unlearn 25 years of entitled behavior, and I'm learning to see her as someone capable of growth, rather than just someone who hurt my family. The real lesson of this story isn't about revenge or comeuppance. It's about the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of what you think they can do for you. It's about remembering that every person you encounter, the janitor, the server, the person behind the desk, has a story, has value, has the right to be treated with basic human respect. Wealth and success don't make you better than anyone else. They just give you more opportunities to demonstrate your character. And character, true character, is revealed not by how you treat people who can help you, but by how you treat people who can't. If you're in a position of privilege, financial, social, or otherwise, use it to lift others up, not to look down on them. If you're being treated poorly by someone who thinks they're above you, remember that their behavior says everything about them and nothing about your worth. And if you find yourself making assumptions about people based on their appearance, their job, or their circumstances, pause and ask yourself, what am I missing? What story am I not seeing? What value am I overlooking because I'm not looking hard enough? Thank you for taking this journey with me. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about dignity, respect, and the quiet strength that changes everything. Remember, character isn't determined by what you have, but by what you do with what you have. And respect isn't something you earn through success. It's something you give because it's right. Until next time, treat everyone like they matter, because they do. 2 more compelling stories are just a click away. If this one drew you in, wait until you see what else we found. Ready to explore?